"Aren't you cold?" I asked Nina. As we walked past the barren halls, my voice muffled through the wool scarf wrapped around my neck. The halls, which were usually filled with the chatter of passing students, now felt deathly ill as more than half of the school's population had stayed home. With the town experiencing record-breaking temperatures, it should have been a snow day. That's why it perplexed me how Nina was wearing clothes more appropriate for spring. She just shrugged. "I don't feel anything," she proudly answered. "I grew up in a country known for its freezing winters. This is nothing." I shook my head and looked toward the hallway, wincing, knowing that 2 left turns would lead me to class. Somehow, Mr. Geller never missed a day. Not even when half of the class was missing would he go easy on us. "I'm going to the bathroom," I told Nina, who was already aware of my habits. "Tell him I'm feeling sick or something." She nodded before the 2 of us disbanded. As soon as I entered the female washroom, I found a wall to lean on and closed my eyes. A few seconds were all I needed, but I couldn't even get that before my thoughts were cut through by the piercing sound of alarms, jolting me back to reality. Not soon after, the principal's weary voice boomed over the intercom. "Please stay calm and do not let anyone inside your classrooms, no matter how convincing they may be." That alone was strange, but what followed tightened a grip around my heart. "The school will be in quarantine. May God have mercy on our souls." A shuddered breath later, the speakers went quiet. For a few seconds, I couldn't begin to comprehend his words. Had I just imagined all of that? Surely, that was the only plausible explanation. Principal Dunn was the last person to ever make a joke, leaving only 2 possibilities. I had somehow misconstrued his words beyond recognition, or he was dead serious. My first thought was to text Nina to see if she had heard it, but when I heard something outside, I figured I would ask them. The moment I exited the washroom, however, the sound of someone screaming bloody murder echoed throughout the hall. From around the corner, a student dashed in a straight line. Unable to change his trajectory in time, he crashed into the lockers, the metallic clang reverberating. He barely had a chance to look at me, his arm pathetically reaching out, as if he wanted help before he was impaled by the spindly, misshapen arm of a blonde wearing a cheerleader, which was now stained crimson. From how disfigured she was, I would have never assumed that was Cindy. Each limb was more malformed than the last, her head being the worst. It swayed like a pendulum, her gangling neck unable to hold the weight of her tumor-infested cranium. That was all I could make out before I instinctively closed the door that led to the washroom in an attempt to avoid the sight. It didn't work. Even though my eyes were averted, I could still hear everything. The gut-wrenching snapping sound, the wails of the kid, then silence. The hurried rhythm of my breath echoed off of the bathroom walls, prompting me to seal my mouth shut. The sound of wet shoes dragging against the floor edged closer and closer to my position until they were right outside. By the time the door was being pushed, I had already climbed atop a toilet, raising my feet so that whatever it was couldn't find me. Immediately, my nostrils flared as a pungent, foul stench invaded my nose. It took everything I had not to gag, fearing that so much as breathing too loud would result in Cindy finding me. Finally, after an agonizingly slow walk, the shambling cadaver reached the stalls. Her sneakers were now drenched with a dark red liquid, which I could have sworn was steaming from how fresh it was. A trail of blood followed her right leg, which she had to drag across the ground to move. Once she was standing in front of my stall, she stopped, turning around so that her shoes pointed toward me. At that moment, any hope of living had gone out of the window. If she just looked over the stall door, Cindy would find me, and that would be the end of it. But she didn't. She just stood there, her body not even making a single noise. Not a heartbeat, nor a breath. It was like staring at a statue, her entire body unmoving, waiting for me to make the first move. When several minutes passed without anything happening, Cindy took to slamming her body against the door, the hinges creaking and threatening to come loose. I was thankful for the sudden burst of noise, because if not for it, she would have heard my whimpers. Just as the nails holding the metal hinges in place were inches from popping off, she stopped and moved to the next stall like a shark looking for prey. The same process repeated for each stall until finally she concluded that no one was in there and shuffled back out of the washroom, having difficulty opening the door judging from the sound of the knob bouncing against the frame. Once the door was fully closed, I sighed, not realizing how long I had been holding my breath, until I felt my vision become blurry from the lack of oxygen. I allowed myself to take a deep breath of air, making up for the lost time, before climbing off of the toilet. My legs were shaking, and I considered simply staying here until the proper authorities came. And that's what I did. For For the next hour, I spent my time tinkering with my phone. My first plan of action was to call the police, but not so much as a cycle of the dial tone could be heard before a robotic voice informed me that they couldn't take a call from my location. I tried, my phone history stacking with call after call made to 911. Each attempt taken minutes apart, but each had the same outcome. When it became clear that the cops weren't coming, I opted to try my parents instead. Nothing. Figuring that other students could at least receive my messages, I wrote a barely comprehensible message to Nina about what happened. The letters typed hastily, as I tried to keep my nails from clicking against the glass screen. And yet, when I pressed send, the red text underneath my block of mad rambling read "not delivered." At that point, my hands began shaking uncontrollably, my mind racing at the possible ways I could escape the school. With no reception, and a deranged monster lurking outside, the options were few and far between. Maybe my phone was the only one failing to work, and I should just wait for someone else to come. My reasoning, appealing to both the logical part of myself and the part that couldn't even bear the thought of standing, won over. And so, I waited. 2 hours passed. Every now and then, I would open my phone and try calling someone, and every time, my attempts yielded no results. Hunger and thirst began to set in, although I tried brushing them aside, since I wouldn't need to worry about starvation or dehydration for a while. After the 3rd hour, something disrupted the mindless waiting. I couldn't tell what they were, but a glimmer of hope suggested they were bullets. Rapid, successive bangs, followed by periods of silence. It was almost 5, and be it a mixture of boredom from sitting in the same seat for hours, and fear from hearing the gunfire, I couldn't take it anymore. So, with my body numb from the waist down, I stood and slowly inched open the bathroom door just enough to see the end of the hall, where the sounds had originated. Nothing. The hall was as empty as could be, and since I was in the middle of the school, there were no windows to tell me of the time, or if sirens were blaring in the distance. Cautiously, I stepped outside, looking left and right for any sign of movement. There was none, just the quiet hum from the flickering lights that sat above me. It abruptly shut off, but working electricity was the last thing on my mind. Then, something hit my head, something wet, like a leaking faucet. I tilted my head up and froze once I was met with the sight of Cindy, the white, bony blades protruding from the palms of her hands latching onto the ceiling. Her mouth, unable to be closed properly due to the obscene size of her teeth, fell open, releasing drops of viscous, crimson saliva that landed on my hair and face. Cindy's head twisted with the grace of a broken doll, her sunken pupils narrowing into pinprick lines. Once she spotted me. Without hesitating, she pushed herself off of the ceiling and launched herself at me, her throat producing a gurgling shriek. I jumped forward, narrowly missing her as she crashed into the ground head first, her neck snapping and twisting into a right angle. Though she was far from dead, the sudden impact must have disoriented it because her arms and legs attempted to find footing, her wet shoes serving only to cause her stumbling form to slip and slide across the linoleum floor. I dashed down the hall before my mind could even catch up to my legs. The next right would take me to the exit, where I could finally escape from this nightmare. However, as my sneakers skidded to a halt, and I prepared to continue my mad dash, the window panes surrounding the exit doors revealed darkness. At first, I thought that was because of the night sky, but then I realized the sun should have still been out at this time. That was when I realized something. It wasn't the sky, but a series of layered plated metal blocking the windows, and, in turn, the door. My mind, already racing with enough questions, couldn't begin to piece together why there were barricades. They weren't there this morning, and, more importantly, who put them there? Unfortunately, I had no time to think because, before I could even look to my right, I was slammed into the lockers, all the air in my lungs leaving me. My side burned with a deep gash, and as my head weakly lifted itself, I realized it was Cindy's doing. The blade jetting out of her palms, more dull than sharp, was coated with a layer of my blood. As I stumbled back, using the lockers as a support, the wound throbbed. Blood trickled out of the cut and through my clothes, soaking them in a shade of red. My legs gave out, dropping me to the floor, and I could only have slammed my eyes shut and hoped that my death would be a quick one. But instead of the thing's contorted vocal cords releasing yet another screech, my eyes were pierced by a series of thunderous booms. Not because she targeted a non-lethal area, but because the monster never had a chance to attack at all. I was always told guns were loud, but hearing the cacophony of hot metal tearing through the air was a whole new experience. The sound of a single gunshot was enough to pierce my eardrums, thankfully sparing me from having to withstand the rest of the storm. Cindy's body, which was already corrupted beyond repair, was now nothing more than a bullet-ridden rag doll, the only thing keeping it standing being a pair of twitching, malformed legs. The shells struck the lockers right above me, and I put my hands over my head to shield myself from the metal debris that rained down on me. A mixture of blood, pus, and an unknown liquid I couldn't hazard a guess on sprayed out from the emerging holes. A particularly accurate bullet pierced her thread-thin neck, and the skin, unable to support the weight of her skull, snapped. Her head dropped to the floor, surprisingly brittle. A crack formed along the side, and I could see the flesh drooping down as a result of gravity. The rest of her body followed, and I could see it still twitching. Cindy thought she didn't deserve this. No one did. I turned her head away so that those lifeless eyes weren't staring straight at me, and wiped the balmy, black liquid that covered my clothes. After all, I couldn't waste time grieving when someone had just saved my life. I finally looked up, and hope immediately rose as I saw a man armed with a rifle, covered in matte black armor. His visor was down, making it impossible to discern any details, but he was a human, and that's all that mattered. On his chest wasn't the initials SWAT or anything remotely familiar. No, instead, there was a series of letters I'd never seen. MCRC. Of course, I couldn't care less about what division of the military he worked for. He had just saved me, and he would hopefully get me out of here. So, as soon as I could, I lifted myself to my feet, my legs still wobbly, but I managed to stay upright. The wound caused me to falter back onto my knees, the blunt damage having more of an effect than the gash itself. That, unbeknownst to me at that time, was a miracle because as I regained my footing, a boy ran out of the washroom located in the hallway the soldier was standing in. Oh, thank God, he exclaimed, relief washing over him once he saw the soldier. The boy took another breath of air to continue speaking, but before he could, the man, who was now facing the student, raised his rifle. It was so sudden, so quick, I couldn't begin to react. The ringing in my ear, which had just begun to die out, returned once another hail of scorching lead rained down on the kid. He should have been dead at the first or second bullet rupturing his skull, but the soldier only continued to hold the trigger down, even long after the boy slumped against the wall in a mess of steaming meat. As if that wasn't enough, he dropped the magazine onto the ground before loading a new one into the rifle and repeating the process. By the time he was finished reducing the boy into nothing short of a fine paste, HD returned his attention to me and Cindy. I was already on my feet, pushing through the aching pain as my legs carried me as far away as possible. If the exits weren't an option, my only choice was getting to my classroom, which was where the other divergence in the hallway where the boy died led to. As I stumbled through the halls, I could make out a chorus of screams in the classrooms, which were silenced by a series of deafening bangs. They only served as reminders for the man behind me, who had taken to making sure Cindy was dead. The one time I looked back, I saw him casually pointing his firearm at the corpse of the girl, not troubled by the urgency the situation called for. It didn't take long for him to notice me, the clapping of my shoes against the floor echoing through the hallway. Once he did, however, the man didn't break into a sprint or aim his rifle. He just began walking, like a predator exhausting its prey's stamina, before finishing it off. Eventually, I reached the classroom, and Mina must have heard me from inside because she slipped through the door, making sure not to make noise. At the time, my consciousness was already fading in and out, and seeing my best friend alive and well was enough to cause the dam to break. My breathing grew erratic, and my chest felt tight. When I got into the range of her arms, she wrapped them around me without a word. Though I needed her support, we couldn't afford to stay in place for too long. Nina, we have to go inside, I choked out, only realizing now that blood was clogging my throat. Nina's grip, however, didn't loosen, and she pulled me closer. There are people, I thought they were coming to save us, but my words trailed off as the door to the class slowly opened with a drawn-out creak. My heart stopped as the first puddle of blood made itself known, followed by the mutilated corpses of the students. They were clumped together, making a nest of red, barely recognizable. Not a single one was alive, none except Nina. I tried pushing against her, and though I was already weakened from the injury, she didn't even budge. Whimpers that were meant to be her name spilled out of my mouth, but she remained silent. As ever, her smile still stuck to her face. Then it stretched and stretched and stretched until the line separating her lips wrapped around her head. Several other lines followed after that, like segments of an orange, and the sound of tearing flesh and cartilage echoes from behind her face. The petals peeled back, countless teeth lining the inside of each fold. A black void that led to her throat sputtered. From the depths of Nina's body, a long, sharp protrusion emerged. Like a serpent, her tongue slithered out of her mouth, a pair of mandibles lining its sides. I was paralyzed, allowing the folds that made up the outer shell of her mouth to slowly wrap around me. Like the inverse of a flower blossoming, the rows of fangs lining the inside closed in on my face, the tips piercing my cheeks. Suddenly, the now familiar sound of gunfire rang out. I had expected the bullets to pierce through my body, but the pain didn't come. Once the torrent of hot lead stopped, I turned around. Somehow, Nina's tongue managed to deflect every one of those marble-sized rounds, which only bruised the appendage. Her meal interrupted, Nina closed all but the 2 lower flaps, the lines separating them disappearing. Her eyes narrowed into thin slits, and her nose flared. Gripping my arm, she tossed me against the inside of the classroom with inhuman strength. Before slamming the door shut, I found myself joining the pile of corpses, which was still warm, from the blood leaking out. Like a bear preparing for hibernation, the creature that was once Nina hoarded her food, piling the bodies until the floor couldn't even be seen. She slammed the door shut, not even bothering to finish me off since she knew I couldn't escape. The plates of steel that lined the windows on the exit had also been placed here, meaning that I was trapped, with nowhere else to go. I pushed myself off of the ground, as the sound of gunshots continued to ring outside, searching for the closest hiding spot. My eyes landed on the closet near the teacher's desk. I sprinted towards it and shut myself in. Just as I did, the sound of something breaking through the wooden door reverberated throughout the classroom. Peering through the slits, I saw Nina stumbling in, her form crumpling under the constant, deafening fire. Unlike Cindy, however, her skin was thick enough to prevent major damage, allowing her to fight off the MCRC soldier. That advantage was soon reduced to nothing as 2 other members came in, showering her with bullets. With a final, ear-piercing screech, she collapsed. I could hear her struggling to lift herself off of the floor, the soldiers continuing to pour lead into her until her body, having endured too much, was left lifeless. The 3 men were silent for a moment, then one walked up to her, and after a few more shots, I could tell they were sure she was dead. One of them pulled what I presumed was a radio, but my hearing was still damaged, and I couldn't tell what they were talking about. While he spoke, the other 2 set their eyes on the class, targeting every potential hiding spot, every one of the desks and chairs, every object, every crack in the floor. Their gazes scanned the room. Then, the gunfire continued once more. I couldn't even fall to the floor, the size of the closet barely fitting me as is. My sobs were drowned out by the cacophony. The tallest of the soldiers, upon making sure nothing was hiding underneath the teacher's desk, turned towards the closet door. He took a few steps, aiming the muzzle right where my head would be, and I squeezed my eyes shut. Suddenly, a scream, followed by the sound of something being crunched, drew his attention. Nina had wrapped her petals around the head of the second soldier, her teeth biting through the armor, and I could hear the squelch as her teeth pierced his skin. Once she bit his head off, she turned toward the 3rd soldier and threw it at him. His visor cracked from the impact, impairing his vision, giving her enough time to force the tendril inside the corpse of the headless soldier, and, using his body, aimed the rifle and fired. Though it was far from accurate, enough bullets managed to penetrate the man's helmet, and he fell. Before she could turn towards the man in front of the closet door, however, he fired a revolver shot that eviscerated the hand of his comrade, then another targeting the appendage. The worm-like tongue fell to the ground, writhing and lashing out at anything near it. A man charged toward Nina, giving me enough time to open the closet door and hide under the teacher's desk. Though there were countless holes in it, since he had already checked it, that meant he wouldn't check again. The sound of his heavy boots echoed throughout the room as the 2 battled. I peeked through the holes and found him smashing her knees, crippling her. He reached into the gaping hole, grabbed the remaining tongue, and started pulling it out. The creature howled, attempting to claw at his arms or use her teeth, but it was useless. Eventually, with a yank, her tongue was unearthed from her body, followed by a bubbling, black mass that hissed. The soldier dropped the appendage and stomped down on the mass, its splatter muffled by his heel. Nina's body deflated and stilled as it joined the corpses on the floor. The soldier turned towards the closet, firing the remaining rounds in his revolver straight through the metal where my head would have been. "Room 402 is clear," he announced, lowering his pistol. A groan escaped his lips as he looked at his 2 comrades, 2 officers down, no other survivors in the room or hallway. The other line on the radio said something, though I couldn't make out what. Roger that. Moving to sweep 305 now, he responded, holstering his pistol and switching back to his rifle. Before he left, though, he looked at the pile of bodies, clearly considering whether he should do something about it. Screw it, the fire will take care of them, he muttered before walking off, the sound of his heavy footsteps fading into the distance. The doors and windows were barricaded, making escape impossible, and what he said about a fire. They were planning to burn this school down, along with anyone trapped inside. Every time I felt enough bravery inside of me to exit the desk, I would hear footsteps passing by, and the unbearable dread returned. I knew I should just walk up to one of them. It would be a fast death, but I was a coward and would rather remain passive. The wound dealt to me by Cindy hurt, but it was remarkably shallow, meaning blood loss wasn't an option. Reddit seems to be one of the only social medias that hasn't been, so I've been writing this for the past hour or so. It's 7 now, and there's no signs of the metal plates being lifted. I don't want to burn. I don't want to die. I haven't even texted my parents to let them know I love them. Please, help me. Havenwood High School, room 402. Please, send someone. I can start smelling smoke already.